Perched high in the sky, Mount Everest stands as a cold, relentless giant, watching over the world below with a silent, predatory gaze. For decades, climbers have been drawn to its deadly allure, compelled by a desire to conquer the highest peak on Earth. Yet this ambition comes with a terrifying cost, a constant reminder that Everest's stunning beauty hides the brutal dangers that await. Since the 1920s, more than 300 climbers have lost their lives on its deadly slopes, and two-thirds of their bodies remain frozen, trapped where they fell, a haunting testament to the mountain's unforgiving power. These lifeless figures, preserved in the ice, have become grim markers for the ones who follow. They are a chilling testament to the mountain's unforgiving nature. The truth is, Everest often keeps what it claims. The high-altitude environment and brutal conditions make recovery nearly impossible. Moving bodies, some weighing over 300 pounds, is not only impractical but incredibly dangerous. And so, the bodies that remain are a haunting reminder of the mountain's power and the relentless human spirit that led so many to their doom. In this video, we'll dive into the eerie stories of 7 climbers whose bodies are now frozen in Everest's cruel legacy. Viewer discretion is advised. One such climber was David Sharp, a 34-year-old Briton who set out to summit Everest alone in May 2006. With a tight budget and minimal oxygen, Sharp was ill-prepared for the mountain's wrath. On May 15th, he reached the summit, but the descent proved to be his end. Exhausted, low on oxygen and freezing, Sharp sought refuge in a cave where another fallen climber, known as Green Boots, had met his end. For hours, Sharp lay there, struggling to survive. Over 40 climbers passed him that day. Many mistook him for another frozen body, and though some noticed he was still alive, most pressed on, driven by their own desperate ambitions to reach the top. Everest's brutal conditions, extreme cold, lack of oxygen, and the mental toll of altitude made it almost impossible to help Sharp. He eventually succumbed to a combination of hypothermia, altitude sickness, and possibly oxygen deprivation. This was his 3rd attempt at Everest. In past climbs, he had already lost toes to frostbite. Sharp's tragic death in 2006 ignited debates about the ethical dilemmas climbers face on Everest. Despite seeing a dying man, many chose to continue their climb. His death raised disturbing questions about human compassion in the face of danger. Sharp's body remained on the northeast ridge for about a year. Sherpas eventually moved his body to a cliff edge, where they respectfully pushed it over the side of the north face, adding it to the growing number of bodies that Everest has claimed. The madness of Everest is unlike anything else. Scott Fischer reached the summit of Everest at 3:40 p.m. on May 10, 1996. His loyal teammate Lobsang was waiting for him at the top, but something was terribly wrong. Fischer was drained, pale, and sick. Experts believe he was already showing signs of severe altitude sickness, possibly both high-altitude pulmonary edema and cerebral edema. By 3:55 p.m., Fischer began his descent, but it was already too late. The storm was closing in, and Fischer's condition grew worse by the minute. By 6 p.m., Lobsang found him struggling near the balcony, his oxygen mask ripped off. Fischer was lost in confusion, his mind slipping away. He even spoke about wanting to jump off the ridge. Desperate to save him, Lobsang tied Fischer to a rope and dragged him down through the fierce storm. Despite Lobsang's efforts, Fischer could barely manage another 300 feet before his body gave up, collapsing in the snow, unable to move. Around 8 p.m., Lobsang and Fischer encountered another climber, Gar, who had been abandoned by his Sherpas and was too weak to continue. Fischer, barely conscious, urged Lobsang to go for help, and reluctantly, Lobsang left them both on a ledge 1,200 feet above the South Col, hoping to find a rescue team. The next day, on May 11th, a team of Sherpas climbed up from Camp 4 to rescue Fischer and Gore. When they reached the ledge, they found Fischer, barely breathing, his body frozen in place. His eyes were lifeless, his teeth clenched, and he was completely unresponsive. The Sherpas quickly realized there was no hope left. At 1 p.m., they put an oxygen mask on him and left a full cylinder, focusing on saving Gore instead. But Fischer was already lost. But then, something unexpected happened. Anatoly Bukri, near exhaustion himself, couldn't give up. He made one final desperate attempt to save Fischer, heading up through the storm at 5 p.m., just an hour before dark. By 8 p.m., he reached Fischer's ledge, but it was too late. Fischer had frozen to death, alone, in the storm. His body was beyond saving. In his final moments, Fischer's body betrayed him. Suffering from the effects of cerebral edema and hypothermia, he stripped off his gloves and jacket in a condition known as paradoxical undressing. It's as if his body shut down and lost all sense of survival. In his last act of respect, Anatoly moved Fischer's body off the main route and covered him up. He took Fischer's camera, his beloved pocket knife, and his eyes, later to be sent to Fischer's 9-year-old son in Seattle. Fischer's body still lies on the triangular face of Everest, just below the balcony, at an altitude of 8,400 meters. He died fighting for his team, even when his own body betrayed him. His death is a chilling reminder of the mountain's cruelty and the unrelenting will to survive that can drive even the best to their breaking point. Then there's Rob Hall, the experienced guide from New Zealand. Hall reached the summit of Everest at around 2:10 p.m. on May 10, 1996, just as the weather began to take a dangerous turn. As the wind howled and the skies darkened, Hall waited for his client, Doug Hansen, who was moving painfully slow toward the top. Hall's Sherpa team, sensing the impending disaster, began their descent at 3 p.m. But Hall's nightmare was just beginning. The nightmare continued for Rob Hall and Doug Hansen as the storm on Everest grew stronger. Hansen had finally reached the summit at 4:01 p.m., but it was already too late. They were far beyond the safe turnaround time, and the descent should have started hours earlier. As they began their way down, only 100 meters below the summit, Hansen collapsed from exhaustion, his body failing without supplemental oxygen. Hall, himself in worsening condition, refused to leave his side, desperately trying to help his client down the treacherous ridge. At 4:30 p.m., Hall radioed for help, reporting their dire situation, but confusion made everything worse. Andy Harris, another guide from Hall's team, was at the South Summit cache with oxygen canisters. Suffering from hypoxia and delirium, Harris mistakenly believed the canisters were empty and radioed that no help could be given. By the time the mistake was cleared up at 5:08 p.m., the storm was already swallowing the mountain. The winds howled, visibility vanished, and the path to Camp 4 disappeared into the storm. Trapped at 28,700 feet, the situation turned even more hopeless. Lopsang Sherpa, descending from the south summit, spotted Harris trudging upward, carrying oxygen and water for Hall and Hansen. Realizing the canisters were full, Harris, knowing the dangers, continued up the mountain in a final act of bravery. He was last seen near the south summit, disappearing into the storm. Hall refused to abandon Hansen, even as the storm raged on. The two climbers struggled down the Hillary step, but Hansen's strength failed him. Hall's final radio transmissions confirmed their worsening condition, but then the signal went silent. Hansen likely lost his footing and fell down the sheer southwest face of Everest, vanishing into the mountain's ruthless void. Hall and Harris managed to reach a small saddle below the south summit, huddling together to wait out the storm. But the freezing temperatures and lack of oxygen were taking their toll. As Hall slept, Harris began to hallucinate, his mind unraveling due to the severe lack of oxygen. He took off his outer layers even though his body was probably frostbitten, a symptom of the brain's confusion in the death zone. It's thought that Harris lost his balance and fell down the steep Kangshung face, his ice axe and jacket found later near Hall's body. By the morning of May 11th, Hall was still alive, but barely. The storm had ravaged him, leaving his hands and feet frostbitten, but he remained coherent enough to confirm Hansen's death and Harris's disappearance. But Hall, too weak to continue, knew his time was running out. His final moments were spent battling the storm, fighting for survival against a mountain that had claimed everything it could. Rob Hall's descent from the summit turned into a fight for survival against Everest's brutal forces. His oxygen regulator froze, leaving him without any supply. At Camp 4, his Sherpas mounted a desperate rescue attempt, battling winds that reached 40 knots in the freezing cold. They climbed up with oxygen and hot tea, but the storm was merciless. They turned back just 700 feet below the south summit, their strength gone. Later that afternoon, Hall made a heartbreaking call to base camp, asking them to contact his wife, Jane Arnold, on the satellite phone. It was his last communication. Hall died shortly after, succumbing to hypoxia and the unrelenting cold. 12 days later, climbers David Britzer and Ed Vist found Hall's body near the south summit. He had arranged his oxygen bottles around him in an attempt to shelter from the wind. His ice axe stood upright in the snow, a final sign of his determination to survive. But the mystery of his body remains. Some believe it's frozen, buried under layers of snow and ice near the south summit where he died. Others think it was moved off the climbing route, hidden from view. The most chilling theory suggests that his body was swept away by violent winds or even pushed off the ridge into the steep, remote Kangshung face, never to be found again. Each of these theories highlights Everest's ruthless, unforgiving nature, where even the most skilled climbers are at the mercy of the mountain. In 1979, another tragedy unfolded on Everest. Gard and Hannelore Schmatz, the first married couple to summit the mountain, were struck by disaster on their descent. After reaching the summit on October 1st, they made their way down, exhausted and drained. The second team, which included Hannelore, reached the summit on October 2nd in worsening conditions. Low on oxygen, they began a perilous descent in heavy snow and poor visibility. Guide Ray Genet, out of oxygen and freezing, refused to continue and decided to bivouac at 8,500 meters with Hannelore and Sherpa Sundar. Ang Jangbu, a Sherpa, descended alone to seek help, but the storm hit and night fell. The storm raged all night, and Ray Genet froze to death, his body buried in the snow. Hannelore and Sundar were left weakened and struggling to survive. The next day, Hannelore collapsed from exhaustion at 27,230 feet, her body too weak to continue. She sat against her backpack, asking for water before succumbing to the mountain's brutal conditions. Sundar, frostbitten and near death, was rescued by other Sherpas. Hannelore's frozen body was left sitting upright against her pack, her eyes open and expression hauntingly still, a grim reminder of Everest's deadly power. In 1984, a rescue team tried to recover her body but suffered more loss, with 2 members falling to their deaths. Over time, the wind carried Hannelore's remains down the Kangshung face, erasing one of Everest's most chilling landmarks. Then, in 1998, a couple from the US, Frances Aaron and her husband Serge, attempted the unimaginable, to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. It was a dangerous feat, one that symbolized their love and thirst for adventure, but the mountain had other plans. Tragically, Frances and Serge's dream would end in heartbreak, forever marking Frances as Sleeping Beauty on Everest. On May 22nd, after 2 failed attempts and extreme exhaustion, they made their final push to the summit. Moving slowly, gasping for air due to the lack of oxygen, they reached the top dangerously late in the day. Frances became the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen, but the descent would be their downfall. Separated on the way down, Serge made it to base camp the next morning, only to realize Frances had not arrived. Fearing for her, he set off to find her, carrying oxygen and medical supplies, but this decision would cost him his life. On May 23rd, climbers from an USC team found Frances just below the summit. She was alive but barely conscious, suffering from frostbite and severe oxygen deprivation. Unable to move, she begged for help. The team, running low on their own oxygen, could only help her so far before they had to turn back to save their own lives. Frances was left behind, still clinging to life. Later, British climber Ian Woodall and South African Cathy O'Dowd found her. At first, they mistook her for a lifeless body, but to their shock, she was still alive, weakly muttering. They tried for over an hour to help, but in the bitter cold and dangerous location, they had no choice but to abandon her. Frances was left alone in the snow, her body still clipped to the guide rope, frozen in time, her peaceful appearance a haunting sight. Climbers would later call her Sleeping Beauty on Everest. Frances died in that same spot, age 40. Serge's fate remained a mystery until the next year, when his body was found by Jake Norton. It seems Serge had fallen to his death while trying to save Frances. For nearly a decade, Frances's body remained visible along the climbing route, a chilling reminder of Everest's cruelty. Ian Woodall, tormented by the memory of leaving her behind, returned in 2007 to bury her. On May 23rd, he found her body, performed a brief ritual, and moved her to a lower spot, ensuring she wouldn't be visible to climbers anymore. In June 1924, 2 climbers, George Mallory and Sandy Irvine, set out on an expedition that would etch their names into Everest's dark history. Their goal, to be the first to conquer the summit. George Mallory, an experienced climber, had already attempted Everest twice. When asked why he wanted to climb the mountain, his famous response was simply, because it's there. He was joined by Sandy Irvine, a 22-year-old engineer with expertise in oxygen systems. On June 8th, Mallory and Irvine were last seen alive by their teammate Noel Odell. From a lower vantage point, Odell spotted 2 figures scaling the second step, just a few hundred meters from the summit. Then clouds rolled in, and they were gone. They were never seen alive again. For 75 years, their fate remained one of the greatest mysteries in mountaineering. Did they reach the summit before dying? In 1999, an expedition set out to uncover the truth. On May 1st, climber Conrad Anker made a chilling discovery on the northern face of Everest. He found George Mallory's frozen body at 26,660 feet, just 2,000 feet below the summit. Miraculously well preserved by the cold, Mallory's body offered clues about his last moments. Rope marks around his waist suggested he had fallen while tied to Irvine. Mallory's right leg was badly broken, but his uninjured left leg was carefully positioned over it, suggesting he had survived the fall for a while before succumbing to his injuries. A pair of dark snow goggles found in his pocket hinted that the fall might have happened at dusk. As the pair descended, their summit dreams slipping away with them. The mountain, however, held one chilling secret. One crucial item was missing: the photograph of his wife that Mallory had promised to leave at the summit. This absence raised haunting questions. Did Mallory and Irvine reach the top before tragedy struck? The mystery deepened, especially because Irvine carried a Kodak camera lent by a teammate, Howard Summerell. If the undeveloped film in that camera was ever found, it could hold the answer to one of mountaineering's greatest mysteries. Did Mallory and Irvine conquer Everest in 1924, nearly 3 decades before Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay? Though their ultimate fate remains shrouded in darkness, Mallory and Irvine's daring spirit continues to haunt and inspire climbers today. Whether or not they reach the summit, their names will live on forever in the hearts of those who dream of the impossible. For nearly 20 years, climbers on Everest's north face encountered a haunting sight, a frozen body forever known as Green Boots. The name comes from the green mountaineering boots still on his feet, making the figure unmistakable. Lying in a limestone alcove, just 350 meters below the summit, this body became a grim waypoint, a cold reminder of Everest's deadly risks. It's widely believed to be Tsewang Saman Paljor, a member of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police who perished in the infamous May 1996 blizzard that claimed the lives of 5 other climbers. On May 10th, Paljor and his team reached the summit despite worsening weather, but the descent turned into a nightmare. Caught in a vicious storm, Paljor was separated from his group. Alone, exhausted, and barely able to breathe, he crawled to a small cave around 8,500 meters, hoping for shelter. The storm raged around him as he shivered in the freezing cold, but the mountain showed no mercy. Paljor froze to death in that cave. For years, Green Boots' body became a macabre landmark for climbers heading to the summit, a chilling reminder of what could happen to those who dared to push Everest's limits. In 2014, at the request of Paljor's family, the Chinese government moved his body to a more discreet location. No one saw Green Boots again until 2017, when reports surfaced that the body had reappeared, partially obscured by rocks. The body remained a haunting, silent witness to the brutal cost of reaching the top. Green Boots, David Sharp, Rob Hall, Hannelore Schmatz, Francis Arson, and George Mallory, these names are forever etched into the icy slopes of Mount Everest. Their frozen bodies left behind in the unforgiving cold stand as chilling reminders of the cost of ambition. Each body tells a terrifying tale of dreams shattered by nature's ruthless hand. But what is it that drives climbers to risk everything for the summit? Is it glory, a thirst for adventure, or something deeper, darker? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling stories from the most dangerous, desolate places on Earth. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, if you dare.